Something you'll notice about the Lord when he talks about the things of God is that he speaks with authority. That's one of the things that really separates him from the scribes and the Pharisees, right? And so he doesn't pitch things in terms of like being one voice amongst many. This is my personal opinion, that type of thing, right? But again, he speaks with authority. And this is relevant not simply in matters of theological discourse or argument, but especially in matters of spiritual warfare. And so, for example, there's this really great story in the Gospel of Mark where Jesus is dialoguing with this unclean spirit. And basically, the spirit begins by trying to engage with the Lord in this kind of lively back and forth dialogue. And so basically what the spirit says to the Lord is, look, what have you to do with us, Jesus of Nazareth? I know who you are, the Holy One of God. But you see, what's interesting is that the Lord doesn't bite. The Lord doesn't swing at every pitch, but instead he's very economical and precise in terms of how he responds to this evil spirit. He speaks with authority, right? And so his response is very economical and very forceful. Very simple, actually. And so what he says is, be silent and come out of him. And with that, the man is freed from being possessed by this evil spirit. Now, the thing I want to impress upon you is that this particular story, quite apart from being this historical footnote, right, is actually meant to kind of teach us certain key principles when it comes to spiritual warfare, as made famous by, say, Ignatius of Loyola, the founder of the Jesuits. And so on that note, a couple things kind of come to mind, right? And so first of all, this notion that we're never called to dialogue with the devil. We're never called to dialogue with the devil. We're never called to intellectually engage with moments of temptation. It's always a bit of a red herring, right? We always think we can think our way out of acute moments of temptation. But even right now, when you reflect on your own experience, that's never true. Whenever you try to dialogue with the devil, whenever you try to intellectually engage with acute moments of temptation, you actually sink deeper into the thing. So again, don't dialogue with the devil. Because you always got to remember that the devil is smart. The devil is brilliant. And he knows your weaknesses. He knows your insecurities. And so what he'll typically do is couch certain temptations in what we might call a certain grain of truth. And so what happens, practically speaking, is that a particular thought or idea comes to our minds, and we might recognize that this is a temptation. This is not from the Good Shepherd, this is from the devil. But again, because this particular thought or idea seems to have a certain grain of truth, like it seems to be at least 1% right, we tell ourselves, well, therefore, I have to intellectually engage with the thing. I have to dialogue with the thing. Whereas in reality, you shouldn't, and in fact, you mustn't. Now, when you hear that, you might think to yourself, well, gosh, how can I tell the difference between the voice of the Good Shepherd and the voice of the evil spirit? Well, certainly it takes time and practice, I suppose, to learn how to discern the voice of the Good Shepherd calling you to new life. But I want to suggest that for myself, something that's been really helpful is to reflect deeply on the parable of the dragnet, which you find in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 13. And so when you think back to that particular story, pretty simple, right? And so there's this image of people on the shore, and they're dragging onto shore this net, which basically contains all manner of fish. And they're separating the fish into two piles, the good pile and the bad pile. Now, certainly when it comes to this particular story, it's meant to highlight primarily the reality of the final judgment, so hopefully it goes without saying. But I would suggest, again, more to the point, that this is also really helpful when it comes to matters of spiritual warfare. And this really comes through when you pay attention to a particular translation issue, right? And so, again, when it comes to this version of the story that you find in the lectionary, what you find is, again, the words good and bad, right? So the good pile, the bad pile. But in original Greek, what you hear is fresh and rotten. Fresh and rotten. And I don't know about you, but I always found that to be extremely helpful because it really helps to kind of clarify the binary option of the exercise. So when it comes to sorting out the fish, it's either this or that. It's either good or bad. It's either fresh or rotten. And when you hear kind of more to the point those terms, obviously, what a contrast, right? So either it's clearly fresh or it's clearly rotten. Now, again, when you apply this principle to matters of spiritual warfare, hopefully you can see where this is going, right? So imagine you're going about your life and this particular thought or idea comes to your mind. It's either one or the other, right? It's either good or bad. It's either fresh or rotten. It's either from the Good Shepherd or it's from the evil spirit. And so the whole idea is that when it comes to this particular thought or idea, do I feel the Lord calling me to taste and see and keep and ponder and to actively savor this particular thought, which is leading me to new life? Or is it something else? Is it a particular voice which is leading me to a place of anxiety, disquiet, and darkness? If that's the case, even though it might have a certain grain of truth, clearly it is rotten, and therefore I'm called to not dialogue with that particular thought or idea. You see, that leads us to the second principle which comes through in the context of the story, right? And this is this notion of firmly rejecting that which comes from the evil spirits. And so again, going back to the gospel, the exhortation is twofold. Be quiet and then come out of him. So firm rejection. And obviously the key principle that's being highlighted here is this notion of firmness. Again, firmly rejecting that which doesn't come from the Good Shepherd. And so St. Ignatius kind of drives this point home by using a very specific analogy. And so just to kind of paraphrase, what he basically says is that sometimes you need to treat the voice of the evil spirit like a nagging and annoying spouse, where sometimes what's required is a firm word at the beginning of the dialogue to keep the thing from blowing up and becoming overly complicated. Now, what's kind of funny, at least from my perspective, is that a lot of people, after hearing about this particular analogy from the writings of St. Ignatius, have tried to downplay what they perceive to be the problematic aspects of the analogy by using what they believe to be comparable analogies. And so, for example, Father Timothy Gallagher uses the illustration of a snowball going down a slope, whether we're talking about a hill or a mountain. And so basically the whole idea is that you need to stop it early, right? And so while the snowball is small, while it doesn't have a lot of momentum, if you stop it by being firm, well, then that prevents it from being a real problem later on down the slope. Now, I got to be honest when I say that I don't really like this second analogy, because I think it's missing something which is really essential to this particular weapon which is meant to be brought to bear when it comes to spiritual warfare, right? Because quite frankly, no one gets angry at a snowball. And this notion of anger, in addition to firmness, is actually really important when it comes to doing battle with the devil in the context of spiritual warfare. And again, that comes through in the first analogy in a way which I would suggest doesn't really come through in the second analogy. Because the invitation, in a certain sense, is to bring a certain passion and energy when it comes to firmly rejecting that which comes from the evil spirit. To treat this temptation as if the devil is trying to rob you of everything you hold dear. Your sense of peace and happiness, your relationship with God, the fullness of life. And so the idea is that once you get a whiff of this thing that he's trying to, again, steal from you with great violence, respond to that with firmness, passion, and even anger. Okay, now at this point, I want to end with a couple of examples just to kind of drive the point home. The first example from the Bible and a second example from a movie, actually. And so with regards to the biblical example, what I'm thinking about is the book of Genesis, particularly the story of our first parents, Adam and Eve. So you think back to that particular story, there's this moment where the serpent goes to Eve and basically tries to trip her up. And so basically what he says to her is, did God say that you must not eat of any tree in the Garden of Eden? Now, to her credit, Eve gives the correct response, right? So basically what she says is that, no, that's not true. What God said was that we can eat of any tree in the Garden of Eden. But the one tree we must never eat from is the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. But you see, what's interesting when it comes to this particular dialogue is that even though, again, Eve gives technically the correct response from an intellectual perspective, at the same time, if you read between the lines, the deed is done. And so the devil is successful in terms of planting a particular seed of doubt in God's goodness and his love in Eve's heart. That leads to original sin and all sorts of dysfunction, which continues even to this day in the context of the human race. And of course, the question is why? Or perhaps more accurately, what could Eve have done to prevent this thing from actually happening? Well, in light of everything we talked about today, the real problem is that Eve talked to the devil to begin with. She didn't recognize this first principle, right? This idea of never dialoguing with the devil. But instead she intellectually engaged with the thing, as a result of which she sunk deeper into it. Because again, you can never think your way out of moments of temptation. But instead you got to recognize that, again, this is not from the Good Shepherd, this is from the evil spirit. And so therefore I'm called to never dialogue, to never engage. That leads us to our second and kind of final example. And again, this is from a movie called Padre Pio, about the life of Padre Pio, starring Shia LaBeouf. Now, I have to admit that I haven't seen the actual movie, but I've seen certain clips from the film that pop up on YouTube from time to time, right? And so one particular scene in question involves the Padre Pio character talking to someone who's off screen, and it's pretty clear that this person is the devil. And so basically the way the scene plays out is that the person speaking off screen, he's speaking words of accusation and condemnation to Padre Pio. And so, for example, he says, look, you're a coward, you're a narcissist, you have abused the trust of women who have come to you, and so on and so forth. Now, in terms of the response on the part of the Padre Pio character, it's kind of interesting, right? So, on the one hand, intellectually speaking, he's saying all the right things. So he says, no, stop, this sort of stuff. But when you look at his body language, when you look at his physiology, it communicates something else entirely, right? So initially he's like kind of like looking down, he's crying, right? So he's clearly giving in to the voice of temptation on a heart level. And then all of a sudden things shift. And then suddenly he has this enormous moment of clarity that this is not the voice of the Good Shepherd. This is the evil spirit trying to rob me of my sense of peace and happiness and joy. So all of a sudden he becomes bold, he becomes brave, he becomes firm. And he looks at his accuser and he says, you say Jesus Christ is Lord. Say it, Jesus Christ is Lord over and over again with greater volume, ever greater intensity, with a certain amount of anger even, if you will. Because, of course, he knows that the devil hates the Lord, and so he knows that the devil will never affirm the lordship of Jesus Christ. And so by commanding his accuser to affirm the lordship of Jesus Christ, he's exposing effectively the wickedness and snares of the devil. Now, just to be clear, when it comes to all these different thoughts and ideas and principles when it comes to spiritual warfare, I want to make sure you have the proper image in mind, right? So, to put it simply, you're not called to white knuckle it. You're not called to constantly live in a state of tension and anxiety and haste. Like, the Lord never calls you to go in that way, in that particular direction. And more to the point, you got to recognize that the devil's power in a certain sense is rooted in fear. So don't go the way of undue haste, anxiety, and fear. That's not good, right? The image you want to keep in mind is this notion of clarity. Enormous clarity about what you're called to say yes to and what you're called to say no to. Let your yes be yes and your no be no. And so practically speaking, what this means is that time and time again, you need to ask yourself the question, is this particular thought or idea which enters my mind and heart from the Good Shepherd? If that's the case, by all means, taste and see, keep and ponder, right? Savor these things which come from the Good Shepherd who calls you to new life, the fullness of life. But if not, if this is a rotten thought as opposed to a fresh thought, well, then obviously you're called to firmly reject. Don't dialogue with the devil. Firmly reject that which pulls you to darkness. And when you do that, the heart very naturally goes to where it's meant to go. The sense of peace and repose, happiness and joy. The type of life that the Lord has always intended for your particular life.